then we'll begin. So, hi everybody. I'm super excited to be here today, and today we'll talk about designing for everybody, thinking about accessibility and inclusion. So for the next 40 minutes or so, I'll try to convince you that this is something that's really important, and also give you tips on how to actually do it. So really briefly about myself, in case you can't see my face here, there it is 3 times bigger. I'm Natalia. I have a background in psychology and neuroscience, and then somehow through going left and right, I ended up in UX. I'm not sure if this is the final destination, but for now I love it. And I got there by doing things like working as a PM. So at some point I was a product manager at a company called HelloFresh that does meal kits, kind of like in the space of supply chain management and food. I also built some startups here and there. As you see, I'm not on the NASDAQ billboard, so they weren't particularly successful, but it was definitely really fun. Currently, I work at Google as a UX researcher, and I work specifically on Google accounts for anybody who is under 13. So for kids, to make sure that they're safe, that they have fun on the internet in a way that makes sense to them, and we can keep them safe and happy exploring the world. And I love to talk. That's why I'm here. I'm very privileged to have the opportunity to talk to you about things that I think are really important. My probably top experience of talking was TEDx, which the guys have kindly linked in the ad. You can go watch it. It was really cool. So I hope that I can keep you entertained for the next 40 minutes or so. So what we can expect today, we'll do a brief intro to inclusive design and what that is. We'll then talk about sensory processing and why that is something that I believe is important. We'll talk about how being inclusive can actually inspire innovation and go through some examples. And finally, we'll have some tips for inclusive designing, as well as inclusive workspaces, and at the end, a Q&A. So let's start with the beginning. Intro to inclusive design. I want you to look at that. Everybody knows what that is. An iPhone. Everybody here knows what an iPhone is. I want you to pause for a second and reflect on who do you think is an iPhone user? What do they look like? Where do they work? What do they do for a living? What's their passions, hobbies, issues, pains, griefs? Think inside of your head. You can close your eyes. You can imagine what that person is like. It's very likely that some images popped up in your head. It's very likely that these images are different for each one of you because of where you come from. But it's also likely that not for many of you, somebody like that came to your mind. It's likely that not many of you thought about maybe somebody that has a physical disability or a cognitive disability. Maybe somebody who is older than what you consider to be a typical iPhone user. Or anybody really who deviates from this idea of an average perfect human. So what is an average perfect human? Does everybody know what this is? It's a normal distribution. So if we measure the heights of everybody here and a few thousand other people and we plot them on a chart, there is this mathematical idea that they will kind of fall into this graph. You will have a bunch of people in the middle who are more likely, who are more frequently of a certain height, and then you have some people at the edges who are either really short like me or really tall like somebody else. So this idea of a normal distribution, although mathematically does work for particular kind of variables, measure height, weight, whatever you might want to think about, doesn't always work in real life. So when we think about designing products, and designing, I don't mean just the UI and UX, I mean generally creating products, creating something new for people to use. When we think about that end user, we kind of expect that there is most people who fall in between, and I want you to imagine that this chart includes a lot of different variables, not just height and weight. There is people who fall in between, who are kind of most people, and then there is people on the edges. Some people here, some people there. And the way that we're trained very often to think is that you need to maximize the adoption of your product. Therefore, what do? You focus on the people in the middle, right? Because there is a few people on the left, there is few people on the right. You cannot make something of an appropriate size that will fit all of those people, so you focus in the middle. You try to build for this average person, and you say, forget left and right, we'll figure it out. Most revenue is going to come from the middle. And that's driven by the idea that if you take a person, you plot them on this chart with all of their different characteristics and whatnot, you're going to end up with something average. Now, I already gave you a spoiler that doesn't work, but let's look at an example. Here on the screen, we have probably my favorite and one of the most prominent examples in history of how averages didn't work, and that really pushed the entire design industry to think differently about it. So in about 1940s, the US were like, right, okay, we need super cool new airplanes for the pilots. They haven't rethunk how the airplane looks like since the 1920s. And they were like, we're going to make it nice and perfect for everybody to fit. And they took a bunch of pilots and tried to design a perfect seat. They did what we would call user research in some shape or form, except that it was in the US military. So they took over 4,000 pilots. They measured them like no tomorrow, height, weight, distance between ears, eyes, you name it. All sorts of things were measured in terms of their physical complexion. All sorts of averages, normal and abnormal distributions were computed. They took all of those numbers, they built a perfect seat. Profit, I already kind of gave you a spoiler. No. They built this perfect seat that was supposed to fit an average of a perfect American pilot, but not even one out of those over 4,000 pilots actually perfectly fit into the seat. And that just did not make sense. We measured it all. Why don't we fit? And that is because average does not exist. Even though you might be able to fit into some average of, for example, you have average height, suddenly your weight is not average, or the distance between your eyes is not average. Or if we go more abstract, your career is not average, your passions are not average, your emotions are not average. You cannot be fit into an average person. And yet we keep designing for somebody who falls in the middle as this average, covers most use cases kind of person, and forgetting left and right of that distribution. So that's where the idea of designing for anyone came. And in fact, the fact that that perfect seat wasn't perfect whatsoever inspired then the US Air Force to design adjustable seat belts, which we all today use in cars, and adjustable helmets, which we also, probably most of us, have used at least at some point. There was this understanding that you cannot have one thing that fits all. You need to have something that fits many. You need to have something that is dynamic, something that is adjustable. So inclusive design is exactly that idea. It talks about the fact that you need to have intentional processing. You need to create products with the goal, as well as in environments and services with the goal of making them be experienced by all individuals. Not just those that fall in the middle, but also those that fall left to right of your perfect idea of what an average human is. And of course, very often that would mean including people who either have disabilities or just different abilities, because who defines what a disability is anyway, but that's a different discussion. So including those people intentionally, as well as those that might have some sort of impairments that we societally tend to consider as being the ends of the distribution. So the first thing that I want to take you away is that average or typical people don't exist, and you cannot design for them. So let's look at an example of how do you not design for an average person. And we'll talk about multisensory design. Now, I'll give you a disclaimer. Of course, there is people with different physical disabilities, and today we will not talk about all of those cases. We'd be here until tomorrow. However, we'll focus specifically today on cases where you might have different sensory perceptions. So sensory, we're talking about vision, hearing, talking, taste, touch, all of those kinds of things. So I want you to look at this picture. There's two cocktails here. We don't know what they're made of, because they're on the screen and not in our hands, unfortunately. But I want you to think, what do you think they taste like? There's one on the left, there's one on the right, one is blue, one is red. Which one of these do you think is sweeter? Who thinks the one on the left is sweet? Or the blue one, let's put it that way. Who thinks the blue one is sweeter?
Yes, for sure.
Okay, who thinks the right one is sweeter?
The red.
Okay, the red one, right. What about this one? Has all sorts of colors. Is this sweet or not? Is this savory, salty? I don't know.
Sweet. Probably sweet.
Probably sweet, maybe sweet, not so easy to decide. The reason it's not so easy to decide is because when we look at things like this, our brain makes very strong associations. Evolutionary, culturally, through years of experience of drinking juices and whatnot, like that guy, you know that usually things that are red tend to be sweet. You think about strawberry, you think about cherry, you think about caramels, and so forth. Of course, that is not always the case. We can all think about something that is red and that is not sweet, but it tends to be kind of like that. And on the other hand, something that is blue is actually a bit more complicated because there is not that many things in the world that are blue, so it's very difficult for us to for sure know what something blue is going to taste like. Now, for something like this, it's uber confusing because there is all sorts of colors here. So how do you even know what something tastes like? When you look at something like this, your brain tries to come up with associations. It tries to look at, okay, I've tasted maybe something orange, like an orange. I've tasted something blue, maybe something pink. And it tries to compute that picture of what this is going to taste like. And that computing in your brain of what things look like and taste like and feel like, and it extends to every single sense that you have, are incredibly strong, and they influence how you perceive all the products around you. So I want to give you another example. These associations are so strong that they also work on abstract senses. Has anybody encountered these before? Do you know what those are? Yes, tell me, what are those?
Boba and Kiki.
Yes. Question to everybody. Which one's boba, which one is Kiki? Is the round one boba or Kiki?
Boba.
Boba. Why?
Sounds more round.
I don't know. It sounds boba. That does not make any sense. Why would round boba does not make any sense? The one pointy sounds like Kiki. And this is an example of something completely random that the brain just goes like, right, okay, that makes sense, so I'm going to stick to that description, and then you do with it whatever you want. And we use that in design all the time. We will use that to make sure that maybe the wording that we use in our copy is particular, the rounded edges or the spiky edges and all of those kinds of things. It's because brain makes those random associations, makes you stick to them, and you cannot really override them. I'll tell you more than that. It's not that you just cannot override them. When you present different senses together, the processing in your brain is much stronger. Now, you'll see a picture here, and I know it has a lot of numbers, but I wanted to show you sort of a real picture from a real scientific paper without Photoshop or anything. But what this is essentially showing you is, if you record brain activity, and that means you see what happens in people's brains, when they are either listening to something or they are seeing something, you're going to have two types of activity. Brain does one thing when you listen, does another thing when you see something. Now, if you put those two and two together, you get some number. Now, if you present two things at the same time, the visual and the auditory, it's not just A plus B. It's actually substantially stronger. And all of those little orange blobs that you see on the screen are all of the brain areas that are active more when you see things that go together in sensory ways, compared to if you just experience them separately. First you listen, then you see. If you do it at the same time, your brain is much more powerful. And specifically, we see that in things like, it's much easier to process. It's actually much easier for people to understand what they're seeing or what they're listening to. They have more empathy and emotions. So it's easier for them to feel something inside of them awakens when there is two sensory streams at the same time. And cognitive processing also improves. So if you ask them to process that information, like complete a task or understand it, extract meaning, they will be faster and more accurate if you present multiple streams of sensory information at the same time. Now, how does this relate to these people? How does this relate to maybe somebody who cannot speak, who is mute and deaf, somebody who is blind, or somebody who maybe doesn't have the same haptic feedback because they have a prosthetic arm rather than our standard physical human arm? What it means for us is that when we try to design for people who are like this, who are lacking a particular sense, and we're saying, I'm not just going to design for a visual aesthetic, I'm also going to put into it some maybe haptic feedback, or some sounds, or if you work in the space of physical products, maybe some extra texture or some extra something else that allows humans to experience more streams of information at the same time. You're not just benefiting those people, you're actually benefiting everybody around. So multisensory design is something that tells you that engaging multiple senses whilst you're designing your products, not just visual aesthetics, but all of it together, creates that immersive experience, not just for those who, strictly speaking, benefit from having a particular source of kind of sensory information there, somebody who is blind or deaf, but it creates the experience that is stronger and more powerful, both emotionally and sensorially, for everybody out there. So the second thing I want you to remember is that building for different sensory abilities actually is better for everybody, even those who, strictly speaking, don't need it. Now, let's look at a couple of examples of that innovation. Here's a book. Let's think together. In which ways could this book, standard book, not be accessible to everybody? Feel free to just shout. Who might not be able to read this book? Somebody who's blind. What else? Somebody who cannot read at all. Yes. Any more ideas? Somebody who has no hands. Fantastic. Those are all great examples of how something like a simple book that everybody has in the house by the dozens is not actually accessible to a lot of people. Like you said, somebody who cannot see, i.e. 3% of people in the world, and I'm not talking about visual impairments like you need glasses, but something that cannot be fixed through a pair of glasses, 3% of those people will never be able to read a book. People who maybe have cognitive or psychological impairments like dyslexia or ADHD, who cannot focus on a book, that's up to 15% of your population, so not really a minority if you think about it. Somebody who cannot read because they've never learned how to read, that is up to 10% of the world population, a huge number. Somebody who doesn't have hands, and that is actually every single person in this room and everybody in the world, at least at some point in your life. At least at some point you were holding 2 bags of groceries, or you're typing something, or you're cooking, and you cannot flip the pages of a book to read it. So something as simple as a book is actually not accessible pretty much to anybody, at least at one point in their life. And the understanding of the fact that you are sensorially limited, even in these simple products, is what drives innovation. So what was invented to fix this problem? Book holding, Braille, great. I don't have any of those examples, but I love those. Book holding, Braille, what else? Podcasts, yes, audiobooks, all of that kind of stuff. So I have 2 examples here. The first one here we see is audiobooks. The one on the left is a scanner. I couldn't find a better picture of that, but here's a fun fact for you. Scanners were first invented to allow blind people to read, because the idea was that we can scan the text and then audio sort of transcribe it. And now we use scanners for something entirely unrelated. And I love how some of you came up with stuff like book holders or Braille. So you see how trying to push the limits of how you can sensorially and physically process an object forces you to create something new. You have no choice. You have to push yourself. And that's how you create innovation. I also wanted to share this picture with you, which is one of my favorite. This is a picture from 1944 of a US soldier, again, pretty much for the first time in his life, being able to read a book by himself by listening to it. And you can see the smile on his face. So you see how powerful and important it is, both to people who were never able to experience something, but also to all of us who at some point have definitely listened to an audiobook or a podcast at least once in your life. Now here's a couple more examples. Sliding doors, for instance, something that we see in supermarkets and shopping malls, was invented specifically to allow people with no hands or people in wheelchairs to actually get to the mall, and yet we all benefit from them when we're carrying the grocery bags. Electric toothbrushes, as well as potato peelers, invented for somebody who might have Parkinson's, i.e. tremor, when you cannot properly brush your teeth. Pretty sure everybody in this room at least once used at least one of those things and probably enjoyed it. And then finally, for example, a typewriter or a keyboard, actually the one that we all use on our computers and phones today, was invented by a guy in 1808 who wanted for his lover to send him letters by herself. She was blind and she couldn't write proper straight lines, so she had to narrate those stories to somebody. He didn't want that. He wanted privacy, and he wanted their love letters to be hidden and just their own. So he invented this machine. So if he wanted to, he would, and he did. He invented a machine for his girlfriend to write him letters in secret, and we all use it today, even though not everybody in this room might actually need one, strictly speaking. So inclusion drives innovation. By default, adopting diverse, multisensory, and inclusive practices leads to unique and innovative solutions because you have no choice. You're pushing yourself through the limit, and you kind of have to do it. It makes you more creative. It opens up your horizons. So the third thing I want you to remember is that you cannot innovate if you do not push your limits, and you have to push your limits. So how do you actually do it? I've told you all of this beautiful theory now, which I love, but what is the practical steps of actually getting this done in your companies or otherwise? So let's start with the first one. The first one is really important, and that is challenging biases. You need to proactively challenge any assumption you make about how people can actually use your product. This fosters inclusivity. It enables you to recognize the unconscious errors that you make when you look at a product. So when you look at something, force yourself to think about, okay, what assumptions am I making? Specifically, you need to write them down. Are you making an assumption that somebody can flip through the pages of a book with a hand? That's an assumption that everybody has a hand. Are you thinking about the fact that people will be able to see your app because they only use it during the day? That's an assumption. Many people will be using your app maybe in the middle of the night when their phone battery is super low and they cannot make the screen brighter, and so on and so forth. You also have to note down things like your worldview. So do you assume that somebody who is using your app definitely knows something about banking or taxis or online shopping? There's a huge proportion of people who will be using your app or your website or your whatever for the first time. They don't know any of that. So you need to be very explicit and conscious about those biases. It also helps to learn about biases, literally reading those. As a fun fact, there is about 188 of them, I think, that are confirmed right now, and that is sort of like these cognitive assumptions, rules of thumb, kind of shortcuts that we use to help us navigate the world. There's 188 of them that muddy and blurry our perception of the world. So just learning about them helps. And every time a thought pops in your head that makes you want to decide how to do something, thinking about, okay, wait, am I being objective and abstract about it, or am I assuming? Am I putting some bias onto it? There's also, of course, an important factor of culture and upbringing. Everybody has different upbringing. Everybody has different definitions of what is okay, what is not okay, how things should work. And just again, being very explicit about those things really, really helps. There's also 2 books here that I wanted to recommend. In case some of you haven't seen them yet. Thinking Fast and Slow is probably the most popular book on this topic, but it really gives you that first insight into the biases and how the brain works and how you can try to trick it or avoid being tricked by it. So I would definitely recommend this book. It's fantastic. And then this book is called Invisible Women, which looks particularly at the lens of women and designing for women. But it's a great example. It's a beautiful illustrative example of how when we don't take into account biases, expectations, worldviews, we build products that are really, really limiting. So I don't want you to think that women are the only group of people who matter to think about these products. Of course not, but this is just a fantastic book that really sparks your mind and makes you think about those kinds of things. Okay, so that was unconscious biases. Now let's talk about seeking breaking points. Again, it's a very active process. You need to proactively identify, specifically sit down and identify points and situations in which your product might exclude somebody or break somebody. Specifically, you need to push your abilities. Take your website, take your app, take your machine that you're building, your car that you're building, whatever you're doing, and use it blindfolded. Turn the lights off and use it blindfolded. You'll be surprised at how many things you actually cannot do because it was never designed for somebody to be blindfolded. Do it in a loud bar. Look at your app and try to focus on it at 12 o'clock at night on the main street somewhere where everybody's screaming and there's drunk people bumping into you. How well can you use that app? For some people, that might be the circumstance in which they use it. You might try to use it in a different language. For somebody who cannot read or somebody that has difficulties with focusing on letters or maybe has dyslexia, ADHD, dyspraxia, any of those things, they will not be able to read your beautiful copy that you spent 3 months writing. Can they understand your app or your product if it doesn't have the beautiful text on it? If they can't, then you're excluding a huge proportion of people from using your app and loving it. Of course, there is also things like asking other people. So one thing is to limit your own experience. Another thing is to ask those who have it every single day. You need to go out there and you need to sort of QA the design of your app by giving it to people that you wouldn't normally think of your typical users. Again, it's a very proactive process. It might mean going on Facebook and looking for a group that's called Blind People of Riga, posting something there and saying, I would love your feedback. It's not something that just falls from the sky. You need to do it actively. But if you do it, it lets you push that limit. So that's breaking points. Now let's talk about a little bit more about pushing those limits in diverse research. It's really essential, and I cannot emphasize that enough, to build accessible and inclusive products by doing research with diverse types of users. It fosters empathy. This is something that Santa spoke about. You cannot really get anywhere without it. It helps you build that community and that understanding of where your users come from. And specifically, there are some ways in which you can do it kind of very practically. First of all, you need to do the research, which means you either hire a UX researcher or you become a UX researcher, but you cannot get around without actually doing the research and actively putting effort, which is time and money, unfortunately for all of us, into it. You have to do it. You also have to involve everybody in the process. You cannot just do the research, look at it, be like, oh, wow, amazing. Anyway, put it into the desk and then it goes to die there, never to see the light of day. You need to bring people on. That means take your stakeholders, take your executive level if you have access to them, take your colleagues, take your engineers, your copywriters, anybody. Take them with you by the hand, buy them ice cream, and make them watch. If you try to just do research and then tell them, oh, I promise you people don't get this, they will tell you, yeah, you're wrong. They definitely get it. But if you actually show this to them, they're more likely to believe you. And also, very importantly, you must do diverse research. If you just pick a white, educated, beautiful, rich person, they will give you one type of feedback, which is very, very important. But if you go for what's called non-weird participants, so not Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and from democratic countries, they will give you an entirely different type of feedback. You need to seek those out people specifically. Like I mentioned, you go on Facebook, you go on Meetup, you go somewhere else. You sit on the street and you look for somebody who doesn't look like you think your typical app user does, and you ask them for feedback. And of course, you also look for people with disabilities. That could be any sort of disability, physical, emotional, cognitive, visible or invisible, and you ask for their feedback because they're different to you, and they'll be able to tell you something else. Then we have actively building empathy, and the emphasis here is on the word actively. So user interviews, observations, engaging with communities is all really, really great, but you have to put extra effort into making sure you feel what those people feel. You experience what they experience. That means launching a survey on some automated platform and hoping that it's going to work is probably not going to cut it out. It's very difficult to understand how somebody blind feels if you've never been blind yourself. You have to really watch people in their natural environment. You have to talk to them, and you have to push yourself for that as well. Now, very specifically, you can do things like observe users in their natural environment. Getting them into your office and asking them to do a task is not the same as them trying to navigate your app somewhere in the middle of a supermarket with a 3-year-old crying next to them. Go and watch them in their real world. You can do things like watch them on the way somewhere, watch them in Disneyland, watch them anywhere where they could be using your app at least once. You'll be surprised by how many things limit people's abilities and limit and sort of alter how they interact with your app. You can also, of course, talk to them. You talk to them either directly through your XR, sort of like your standard method of I'm going to recruit some people, go sit them down and have an interview with them. You can also have things like product experts, for instance, people who've been using a product for a really long time and who understand it inside and out, and you can ask for their feedback. And you have trusted users, people who maybe love your company. Maybe they don't have anything special on the edges about them, but they love your product and they can step into the shoes of others. You can get them engaged as well. And finally, you have to be intentional. And this is something that is super important because none of the other things will work unless you make a point out of it to work. Now, being intentional means that, unfortunately, because of how we are brought up, because of how we are taught, we're not really taught from a young age to look for those edge cases. We're taught for the easy, financially viable, direct path that's going to get you the most outcomes per least amount of dollars spent. So you need to actively change the way your mind works, the way your company works, to allow yourself to explore these things. Now, what this means is doing things like, for example, setting OKRs, so objectives, key results, and goals. If you're in the position to do that from the top, you do it for your team. If you're not in a position to do that for your team, you do it for yourself. You come to your manager and say, hey, can I please spend 5-10% of my time on doing this? You need to try to be very intentional about it. You can also reward practices that are inclusive. Again, if you're at the top, that might mean bonuses, golden stars, ice cream, pizza parties, extra money if you can afford that, that's all fantastic. If you're not in a position to do that, simply saying to your colleague, thank you for doing that, thank you for thinking about it, I love what you're doing, this has been inspirational, makes a huge difference. People love to feel rewarded for what they do. Of course, allocating budget and extra time, if you can afford that, that's fantastic. If you can't, you're going to have to try to deal with what you have by doing things like rewarding people verbally or really trying to evoke those emotions. You can also do things like create events, invite speakers, arrange courses to learn together, to sort of, again, have that framework under which you don't just ask people to go there and figure out how blind people feel, you allow for them to experience that. And it doesn't have to be something fancy where you get somebody really famous to come in for you and speak at the stage for 1,000 people. It can be as simple as saying, hey, I would love to spend the next hour of the meeting using our lab completely blindfolded and in the darkness. And that's going to help you people be in that environment, be in that structure where they can actually explore these things. And of course, very importantly, you need to build a safe space. So space where people can try and fail, because they will fail. And you have to feel comfortable yourself. Now, I understand that not every company allows for that. There is, of course, companies where there is a certain culture that does not allow for failure whatsoever. There is not so much we can do about that from this perspective. But allowing yourself to fail, if you have any leeway and if you feel safe within the context of your company, allowing yourself to try something new and maybe not immediately get it right is going to really help you make that first step forward. So, in summary, you need to acknowledge and challenge biases. You need to look for breaking points specifically. You need to do diverse research with different people. You need to actively build empathy, and you need to be intentional about it. Now, take away from that in one sentence, building inclusive products is an active process. Now, for the last part of what we're talking about, I want to talk about building inclusive teams. Because it's essentially impossible to build inclusive products if you don't have an inclusive team in your company and in your life. What does that mean? When we think about teams and inclusion, very often we think about things maybe like race or gender, right? We want to have a certain number of racial diversity or gender diversity in our company. But inclusion is really more than that. It's also about things like age diversity. Do we have anybody on the team who is older or who is younger? Are we excluding them on purpose or accidentally in the hiring process? Is there anything we can do to bring a different perspective? It can also be things like bringing different backgrounds. Not everybody needs to have gone through a UX bootcamp or have done an engineering degree. Can you bring in a doctor who knows how doctors work to tell you about your medical app? Nothing will be more powerful than that. No amount of courses or Coursera or Googling how do doctors feel is going to replace an actual doctor being there and telling you how he feels. It's also thinking about how you run your company and run your meetings. For example, do you do everything online? Do you do everything offline? How might that not allow certain individuals in your team to really be themselves, to be creative? It's maybe things like asking for eye contact. Have you ever experienced that where you're in a meeting with somebody and they look there on the street and you think, yeah, it would be nice if you listened to me, you're being really rude right now? Not everybody can maintain eye contact, and that doesn't mean that they're bad, that they're not interested, that they don't care. That's also diversity. It also could be things like taking notes. Do you have an expectation of who takes notes or if notes are taking at all, and if so, how do they look like? Is there anything you can do to do that differently? So I want you to walk through a couple of examples of how that might work, but I'll give you a disclaimer. Something like that, as well as inclusive design, does not have a formula. So what I'm going to give you is examples, not rules, and the only rules that you have to follow. So use them as an inspiration, and then try to think about your team and how you can get them to kind of be creative and accommodate who they are. So the thing I want you to remember here is that some of us kind of take certain things for granted, like eye contact, notes, or the age of our team, but to other people that may feel unbearable. And do you remember how at the very beginning I mentioned to you that one of the things that you can do to understand how those different users, different people feel is by doing things like going on social media or talking to them or sort of looking at their feedback? We're going to go through that. We're going to look through a couple of memes of people with different abilities on teams and how they feel about the workplace and how you can change that. So here's the first one. Time management when you have ADHD. ADHD is a cognitive disorder which makes it difficult for people to pay attention to certain things and also comes with the side effect of having difficulties with tracking time. So here's a meme that says, time management when you have ADHD, okay, that shouldn't take long, between an hour and 11 months. Now, that would make a lot of sense to maybe some people here, because how do you mean something could take between an hour and 11 months? Well, I have ADHD and I can tell you very exactly how it can. It can. Sometimes a simple email can take you 6 months to write and you don't know why and you can't do anything about it. Now, how do you deal with that example? For instance, bad time management isn't always a sign of somebody not caring or somebody sort of being reckless or being rude. It can be neurodiversity. It could be cultural difference. So you can rectify that by doing things like setting clear deadlines. So end of Q3 or end of this week is not a deadline for somebody who doesn't understand time as well as maybe you do. By saying specifically 15th of September or 5 p.m. tomorrow, you really break those assumptions of what is end of Q3 and make it easier for somebody to estimate whether it will take you 3 hours or 11 months. You can also do things like send kind reminders, emphasis on kind, and kind of understand that people have best intent. Even if they don't do things in the way that maybe you want them to do or the way that you do the things yourself, it doesn't mean that they don't care. You can be kind to them and ask them again, and they'll appreciate it. Here's another meme that is relevant for actually a lot of different conditions, and I picked it up on some forum. Can you repeat the part of the stuff where you said all about the things? That is from The Simpsons. That specifically refers to the fact that for many people, and you can think about disabilities, cultural differences, people whose first language is not English or whatever language you speak in your company, they might not understand some, many, or any of the things that you're talking about. Has anybody been to Oppenheimer already? Some people here, did you understand any of that movie? None. I came out of it, even though I'm a fluent speaker, having no idea what was just discussed, and I kind of felt like that. So this is an example of something as easy as talking and hoping others understand you that falls through for a lot of people. So you can fix that by doing things like documenting things in writing. It's not enough to just go to somebody and says, can you do that amazing UX research study with non-weird, beautiful participants? No, you have to write it down. They might not remember for it. And everybody in your team will be thankful if you actually write stuff down and not just say it somewhere in passing in the corridor and hope that everybody will remember. You can also repeat yourself, again with compassion. Saying something twice doesn't mean that the other person is dumb or doesn't care. They might have just forgotten, and they will do their best job if you tell them 1, 2, 5, 10 times again, but you just have to be okay with that, because some people need that. You can also do things like simplify your language. Don't pull an Oppenheimer, just use simple English language. People will get you much better. Now let's look at this one. My face when somebody gives me nonverbal communication. This is particularly relevant, for example, for things like autism or for individuals that come from different cultures where nonverbal communication is not so prevalent. Nonverbal communication is things like, oh, you should understand how I feel because I'm looking a certain way or moving my hands a certain way, or maybe I'm using a certain tone of voice or a certain speed. Sort of is this extra meaning we try to extract from the words that people say beyond the words that people say. Not everybody gets that. And you can very easily fix the lack of the understanding of social cues by saying what you want explicitly. I don't hope that you say something and somebody gets it because, well, I said it in an angry voice, so they should have understood that was sarcasm, and I wasn't. No, nobody will get that. Deal with it, move on, just say straight what you want. You can also not rely on subtext, body language, social norms, none of those extra rules. And by the way, writing down happens with that. How many times do you write a message and then people misunderstand you because you weren't there to say it with a certain voice or a certain emotion? That's a great example of how much we rely on those social cues, but that a huge proportion of people just don't understand. So if you can relate your message in a simple, written down way, it will significantly improve both the communication but also the results of the work in your team, and will allow your team to be inclusive and thereby drive inclusive design in your products. There is 2 books that I want to recommend on this one. The Culture Map is a fantastic book that talks about cultural differences and how sometimes you might think that things work in a certain way, but they really don't just because somebody was born or brought up in a different country. It's a very easy, brilliant read in case you haven't read it. And Blind Spot, Hidden Biases of Good People. And I love this name because sometimes we think that if we don't understand some of those things or if we have biases, it makes us inherently bad. It absolutely doesn't. We're all good people who also want to do our best. And all the good and the best people have hidden biases. So this book will walk you through what those biases are and how you can deal with them and kind of combat them and make the best out of your life. So highly recommend it. So how do I build inclusive teams? You'll see here that it's actually the list of the same things that I mentioned to you before. You need to acknowledge and challenge. You have to seek the breaking points, i.e., did somebody not understand my message because it was not conveyed in words, but it was conveyed in subtext or a smiley face at the end of the sentence? You need to do diverse research, i.e., talk to different people in your company, try to hire different people in your company, try to get feedback from somebody who isn't sitting next to you at the desk and who looks exactly like you. You need to actively build empathy, meaning if somebody acts in a different way, maybe that's okay. Maybe you can try to understand them. Maybe you can try to support them instead of getting angry at them. And of course, you have to be intentional. Just like inclusive design, it's not gonna come falling from the sky because we are conditioned from birth to be a certain way, and changing that way takes effort. But that's okay. We all need to put that effort in so we're all in the same boat. Now, there is a little cherry on the cake that I also wanted to mention, and that apart from the ethics and the moral of all of these things, being inclusive actually brings money to your company. So if you're ever struggling to convince somebody higher up that this is not an absolute waste of time, you can refer them to the fact that both BCG and McKinsey, 2 of the best consulting companies in the world, have done tons of research and pretty much unanimously reached a decision that having diverse teams that are inclusive, that push the boundaries of what it means to be a professional, have higher revenues and higher profits, particularly when it comes to innovation-driven revenue and profits. So you can really convince them, if they don't want to listen otherwise, by doing those things. So finally, what I want you to remember, that inclusive design begins with an inclusive team. So you cannot not love, not appreciate, not respect diversity inside of your room, inside of your office, and hope that somehow it will trickle in from the outside and make your product beautiful. It's a mindset change that you have to go through, and it starts within you, and it starts within your team. So inclusive design allows you to do good in the world, but also make your product better and bring you more money. So it's a really win-win situation. Thank you very much for your attention, and we now have time for questions.
Same approach, so who want to start with a question? Yep, see the same game. Sorry.
Hi, Natalia. Thank you so much for your presentation. Pleasure here. So I do have a strange question, probably, or stupid one.
Go ahead.
So basically, it's all about inclusive product for masses. So when it comes to building a business-to-business product, would your approach differ to like building an inclusive product or not?
Yeah, that's a great question. And when I worked at HelloFresh, I was doing, it wasn't business to business, but I was working with internal stakeholders. So the people I was building with was essentially my company. It was an internal product. And I used exactly the same approaches because no matter who you sell to, who you build for, if your product doesn't sell, you also build for people. So that approach does not change. I think in a B2B case, depending on the size of your company, sort of like the size and the size of your client base, if your entire client base is 1 or 2 people, like in an internal product, or if it's a more abstract sort of B2B concept, you might have more or less leeway to talk to different people, but there is still people at the end of that stick. There is still people who will use your product. So the concept is exactly the same. And also importantly, even if you have a small user base of people who will use your product, that user base will change. Those people will not forever be the only ones using your product. One day somebody different will come in and they will use a product and it will break and you will have to start again. So to answer your question, it doesn't change at all. You still need to look at different people. You still need to have empathy, and you still need to keep in mind that it's humans, different humans, non-average humans at the end of it who will use it. Yeah, of course.
Natalia, I have a question, not about your presentation, but about your position in Google. Very interesting. What do you do as a researcher in Google? Please explain.
Of course. So in my position as a researcher, I do research with children. Specifically, my team works on accounts for kids. Does everybody know what a Google account is? Approximately. So you have a Gmail address, and then you can use all of the other things. So everybody here is an adult. But there is also Google accounts for kids, i.e. for anybody who is under 13 years of age in most countries, and it's a legal definition. It varies somewhere, but usually it's 13. And my job as a researcher is to talk to kids, talk to their families, and understand what drives them, what stops them, what they like, what do they not like about using a Google account, and how we can use that to enable particularly kids to use the internet safely and confidently. So an issue that we face, of course, is that kids are exploring the world, they want to learn about new things, and they go out there and they can access theoretically anything and everything on the internet, but there are certain things that are either more appropriate or better or healthier for them depending on their age, and we want to make sure that we create an infrastructure for them to explore the internet safely. So my job is to talk to kids and families to understand what they need and what they want, and then sort of give advice and drive the development of this concept of a Google account for them in a way that we can make them most safe and most happy online. I hope that answers your question. Cool.
Hi, thanks for the beautiful presentation. It was really insightful. The question is about the inclusion. Basically, you mentioned apps multiple times, and apps is that what Chili Labs do. Do you have any like percentage of what kind of top apps have inclusion check, or do you do any stuff like that? Do you have any inclusion checks on top lists of Google and stuff like that?
Of course. So the question was about other sort of inclusion checks in apps, and do we do that inside of Google?
Yeah.
So First of all, there is legal requirements, and that is the baseline that everybody has to comply with. It varies a little bit country by country. The EU, for example, has very specific regulations on what classifies as an app that is inclusive or not, or like any product really. It also deals with, I don't know, houses and buses and whatever. Like there is legal guidelines, and pretty much anything that is being put on the market has to comply to those legal guidelines. So in that sense, theoretically, 100% of things that we see should be there. Practically speaking, that is, of course, not always the case. Now, I don't have a percent because there is hundreds of apps popping up every day and hundreds of websites, but theoretically, there is legal regulations that try to push that number to be sort of as high as possible, and they exist worldwide, including the US, South America, and whatnot. Within Google in particular, of course, we have those legal regulations. We also have internal regulations, which are generally a higher standard compared to the legal minimum, and everything that we do has to go through an internal review to make sure that it complies with our internal standard of what is an accessible or inclusive app or website or product. But of course, part of it is not just passing some sort of check, but kind of having that in mind. So whenever I do research, I always try to make sure to include those different people and stuff like that. And even if that doesn't translate into a particular check, so there is no sort of like list that I need to check off what I've done, I just try to make sure that it's there because it's going to build better products. It's going to drive better features. So to answer your question specifically, no, I don't actually know any percentages. It should theoretically be at 100%. Depending at an internal company policy, it may be better than the legal standard. But I would say sort of like anecdotally, a lot of companies try to at least get there with a legal minimum. But I will also give you a caveat, a legal minimum is just that. It's really a minimum, and there is much more on top of that that you can do. Sorry, I cannot give you a more concrete answer. Yeah.
Thanks. I will use that lunch as well.
Yeah.
So, do you see the trend, like that more and more companies start putting these accessibility requirements into the apps and websites? How it looks like from the site, right?
Yeah.
Becoming better.
Right, so is there a trend of companies doing this more and more? I think there is definitely a trend, but I do think that it's miles behind of where it should be. So if you, for example, right, when it comes to doing user research, I don't know how many of you have an opportunity to do user research in-house, but there is a lot of companies that offer user research, like user Zoom, user testing, user whatnot. There is a ton of those. If you try to go to them and do some research through them, you need to make a specific request for them to include users in your panel that might have a disability or a different background and stuff like that. Whilst in my opinion, that should be the default. In my opinion, it shouldn't require a specific checkbox that says, please, can you give me a diverse panel? It should be a given that you do a diverse panel. Now it's getting there because maybe 15, 20 years ago, that wouldn't even have been an option whatsoever. So it's definitely getting there. And again, I don't have percentages, but it's getting there. But I do think that we need to do much more of that. And we also need, again, sort of like to push the legal minimum because it's very minimal. But there is trends, there is people being more interested in that. I think just the fact that I sort of got a chance to stand here and talk in front of you about these things is also exemplifying that there is general interest in these topics. So I have hope. I do think it's getting better, but I do think it's in our hands to make it even better and sort of like to make it where it should be, i.e. where everybody's treated equally rather than as an afterthought to a standard average user design.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Okay, so if we don't have other questions anymore, yeah.
Thanks very much.
Thank you very much.
We'll talk
Let's have one more
in the
round
break.
of
Bye.
applause.